Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's craft chat. I'm Sage Brousseau, Director of Education at Fuller Craft Museum in Brockton, Massachusetts. Our mission at Fuller Craft is to provide meaningful discovery of contemporary craft through exhibitions, collections, education, and public programs. We are committed to challenging perceptions and building appreciation of the material world. Our purpose is to inspire, stimulate, and enrich an ever-expanding community. And to learn more about our collection, exhibitions, other upcoming in-person and virtual events, or to become a member, please visit us at fullercraft.org. Today, I'm here with my guest, Mr. David Clarke. The leading conceptual metalsmith in the United Kingdom, David Clarke is particularly known for his postmodern recombination of existing historic objects. These deft rearrangements often see the objects taking on lifelike psychological qualities. Clarke primarily works in pewter, a key material for everyday use in the 17th century, and the artist has done a fascinating series of sculptural works in which metal is exposed to salt, sugar, and other substances. These objects are infused with humor and subversion, provoking conversations about both historical traditions and contemporary culture. A graduate of the Royal College of Art, he has been a lecturer in Europe, Asia, and North America, and was the recipient of the Sotheby's Award in both 2007 and 2010. His work is included in many of the finest public and private collections in the world, and his work is in the Fuller Craft Museum right now as a part of our Another Crossing exhibition, which is super incredible, and I'm very excited to have you here today, David, to talk about your experience. Welcome.
Thank you, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, but not yet. I think the start is always the hardest.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to remember that I'm not a historian. I'm not a specialist. I'm not a doctor in this topic, and I was one of 10 artists thrown into the deep end of this journey of kind of discovering and unpicking and unpacking this historical event, which was the Mayflower crossing 200 years ago last year. For me, it was really troubling. I got deeply angry, upset, and it was really tricky. And to a certain extent, it's still really difficult to talk about. So I think it's really good to try it and talk about this.
Yeah.
And the issue, one of the main issues for me is how heavily romanticized the whole episode has become, and who has authored this romanticization. And I'll unpack that the more we go on. However, what I can state as a flawed human being is that I have stolen, lied, and cheated through this project. And that's absolutely what the Pilgrims did. And Glenn gave me that as an opportunity. And he was absolutely willing for me to do that. But I will not tell you how I lied, cheated, and stole today.
Okay.
First of all, what I'd really like to do is give some thanks and some appreciation, because I always forget, and I've written it down, so I do this. And it's a very quick list of Dr. Stephanie Pratt, who did not give me the golden ticket out of the project, and I was desperate to leave on day one. But her presentation gave me the realization that I'm completely ignorant of history and what has gone on, and our connection, and how, in all honesty, we really don't learn from it. And the Mayflower crossing and the consequences of it still are now and still are impacted on the Native Americans. Jonathan Perry, for his generosity in sharing all of his knowledge and wisdom during the project, and it was extraordinary to have time with him and to talk with him. Lucy Rhodes, who with her expert knowledge in producing the linen, which is part of the piece. Julian Coode, who is the smith, and he smith the iron for the tooling and for some of the apparatus in hanging or lynching the piece. Arthur Beales, who's the London's oldest chandlers, for providing the ship rigging, which is part of the install. And Addie Tock and Simone Ten Hompel for giving me the space, the time, and the ability to make the piece in the shared workshop. There is likely to be swearing involved within the presentation. It will not be gratuitous, but it's essential as part of my language to express with some base language when it's necessary. So apologies in advance if you're offended. I'm going to keep it really brief as to what the brief was. And it was really to respond to the Mayflower crossing and to use, Glenn also asked us to use the techniques of 1620, which I kind of thought was crazy and a really ridiculous idea. And I wasn't too bothered about it. And I didn't get stressed out about it, but I just had it in the background and didn't get too anxious about it. We had 2 research trips, one in Plymouth, UK, and one in Plymouth, America. And I was so irritated and just so frustrated by this lack of fact. So there was hearsay, there was speculation, there was myth, there was nothing concrete. We were walking around Plymouth, this is in the UK, and this is a tour guide who was sort of waving these pamphlets at us. And it was like, it's speculated that the ship left from here, but we're not sure. These are the steps, but we're not sure if they trod on the steps. And I was like, but what are we talking, what are we dealing with if there's no factual, what are the facts? And it was also really interesting that because the Mayflower cargo was human, it wasn't registered. So then you're like, well, was there even a Mayflower? And what is this project about? And it was awful. And the evening then, we had a presentation from Dr. Stephanie Pratt, and I contacted her. I went up to her at the end, and I just thought, I can't cope with this. This is not for me, and this is just a hideous project. And I don't like the sound of it. I don't like the look of it. This is nasty. And she said to me, she said, it's bigger than 2 nations. This is about humanity. And she said, and the clearest way that we can discuss this is through art. Mm-hmm. And I was like, shit. I am obliged. I have to then do something. But I didn't know what. And I was looking at objects, and I was desperately trying to find a way in. And I couldn't find a way in. And it was, I had space between Plymouth, UK and Plymouth, America, and still was none the wiser. And so it was like, I don't know what this is. I can't get to grips with this at all. And it was, I knew that I didn't want to go to a form, which is my usual track of getting an object and shifting an object. And it was really interesting. People were saying, I think you should do this. And I was like, well, maybe, but no, I need to find a different route. And I had decided that I really wanted to take the challenge as the project and really hopefully shift a kind of a way into something and not use my normal methods. From the trip, this was from the USA, this hideous poster, which is not historical, it's up now. I was just so shocked by this kind of awful message and blatant use of weaponry and intimidation and the language and the premise. And there was one day that we were walking, and we turned a corner, and Jonathan Perry was like, "This, I'm going to show you a sacred trading route." And it's still sacred, but there were houses, we turned a corner and the houses were being built on it. And it's kind of, there is no sacred. It's kind of so, the relationship with the Native Americans was so black and white there. And it really hit home how just appalling the situation still is. and so there were things, and I was saying earlier before we started the recording, that COVID has been really helpful in finding these reflections and these connections and understanding more about what went on in the project, because it's not so new. And I had conversations with Jonathan, and I needed to find a kind of place where we could agree on something. That I needed an agreement. I had enough with conflict and with weaponry and war and all of this kind of awfulness of kind of taking over land and people and belongings and it was like, I need somewhere where I can feel that there's some hope and a language that I can work out from. And we were talking about metal, and that the hierarchies, the European hierarchies, are slightly different to Native American hierarchies, and their value for copper is much, much higher than ours. And what we agreed, what our natural agreement was, when I said, what about lead? He said, bad. And I was like, oh my God. Now I have a material that we mutually could have a handshake and an agreement and an acknowledgement and a point of connection, which isn't a trade or an argument or a discussion. It's just a pure agreement. And so I came away with from America knowing that lead would be a material to rethink for myself. I'd used lead before. So the lead thing became really, really important. This is a painting in the Pilgrim's Hall, which again just knocked me over the edge of decency, and I had to leave the gallery in the way that it was being spoken about. And this propaganda, I would call it, of the depiction of the Pilgrims arriving in America, and the posture for me was hugely problematic. The symbolism, all of it. I mean, the Pilgrims, I think, had nearly 60 days on the sea in storms in winter, and they look pretty good. And I think that is probably bullshit. I wouldn't be looking like any of those if I'd had 55 days on a ship.
Inaccurate.
And so what was also really interesting was that one machine that was on that ship, allegedly, and I'd say all of this is allegedly, was a printing press. And for me, that was super interesting because it weighs a ton, it's iron. But it can come straight off the ship, and they can generate information, knowledge, and share news, events, and propaganda about how good life is. Which I would also say is factually incorrect. And so this idea of, this is not fact, but this is a depiction, it's an illustration, it's a piece of storytelling that's still used now, and is still really held up very, very highly in a lot of galleries. It's John Sargent who painted it. It's been restored for the Pilgrim Hall, and I hate everything about it. And it really, again, in reflection, this became a really key piece in my thinking around painting and portraiture and what's depicted, how the materials. With the stress of it all, we kept on going around we kept on finding multiple rocks with 1620 on it, saying that this was the rock that they stepped on. And Alison, who is also an artist, saw my stress, and the rubber rock on top, which is made in China, she bought me, and it's like a stress ball. So every time it followed me the whole project. It's now disintegrated, it doesn't exist, but it was this stress ball that I was just like squeezing the whole project and sharing it with the other artists, because it was just like, this is just a holy nightmare, and what have we got into? And it was really, the 10 of us, it was extraordinary how we sort of grappled, and the discussion and the debate and the problems, and things just kept on. The discussion was incredible within the 10. I mean, that was an extraordinarily positive thing that came out of the project, was this kind of group and how the group worked, and there was no ego. It was just really extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's a lot of positivity that came out of it. I mean, it's just if you can look at forcing ourselves to reconsider history, written history, and passed on histories, a positive, which I do. I mean, it definitely seems like that's the collective result.
Yeah,
Besides amazing artwork.
yeah. I think, yeah, so I got back to the workshop and I was looking at bullets and this trade. I mean, we went over with rifles and bullets and we traded for beaver fur. And so we were swapping weaponry. And of course, the Native Americans were able to refine our weaponry even better than we could because their skills were better. And we would buy them back and we would shoot them more efficiently because of their skill and their knowledge and their understanding of material. London actually had I've forgotten the name, a drop tower. So bullets were being made in London just on the south bank of the Thames. And it's a really extraordinary process of dropping molten lead from height. And as it drops with gravity, it becomes these spheres and then into water. And that's the production of how you make bullets. So I started to buy kilos of bullets shot. And I got it into the workshop and I just started to investigate and this kind of, like, I know I want to use lead. It's poisonous, it's toxic, it's unhealthy. It's got really great connotations for me. And as I said, I have history with it. But I wanted to introduce another very, very opposite material. And I started with medicine bandages, which was really interesting because I just went into the local chemist and I bought a sheet of bandage, and it was exactly the same dimensions as my body when I opened it out. And so this relationship to body, to skin, to carcass, to human scale became quite interesting in the development and the research. And on the left-hand side is bullets which are hammered into muslin. And what was really interesting was I then became really aware of the process that that was a violent process, the idea of smashing or hitting or smacking. And it's like, that's wrong. That's not right for the project. That's not right for me to impact on that material in that way. And it just became so beautiful that it was just like, it's too sweet for me. It's just nice. And for me, that was super dangerous. So, and it was sort of starting to look like fishing nets or sequins and it was really the wrong direction. What I loved about it was the fact that everything started to disintegrate in time. This whole thing just started to fall to pieces. The more I worked it, the more I lost the control of the structure. And the weave just started to fall to pieces. And so I got Lucy to weave up some linen. And I just had to get on with it. And there was a spot between these where I was starting to solder bullets together, which was everything just melted. And then I was just thinking, well, linen will burn if I pour because it's a weaker material. And actually it didn't. And I was like, shit, that's incredible. What? And it's this sort of assumption of material and material quality or material, what materials can do and what they can't do and what we assume about them. And so I just started to chuck lead onto it and just think about what kind of weave was important and should it be cloth? Should it be closer to the canvas used for portraiture? Is there something in between? And it was sort of the in-between weave that it became more interesting, that it wasn't clearly on one side or the other. And then I had an oval, and I have to thank Tracy Rowledge, the woman that kicks my ass in the workshop now and then when I need that kick. And I called on her and I said, I need you in the workshop to have a chat. And I didn't have anything. And I produced these to get some kind of feedback. And they were small miniature portraitures. And the qualities were really, really exciting and really fascinating for me. But I'd sunk back to my traditional method of producing a series. And it was kind of safe to do that.
I'm going to interrupt.
Go.
So the title of the piece that we have on exhibition is Portrait.
Yes.
So can you talk, and you just kind of referenced it a little bit. So tell me a little bit about that and how.
Yeah, the spelling. Yeah, well, the oval is a direct relationship and has a direct language to the portrait. I had started to look at different portraits of that period and specific people. And the oval, because I wasn't working with a recognized form, it had come from material, but I wanted a form to make sense. And so I was again at the bench, and this is where good titles normally come, is through making and thinking at the same time and just getting on with stuff. But I wrote down pour as in Poor, and then trait. And this idea of the traits of human beings, the sadness, the poorness, the poor decisions. And I then discovered the portrait of Pocahontas in the Smithsonian, which is very, very famous. The artist is unknown, but the oval was just dreamy, which I think is the next shot. So this, I spoke to my twin brother, and he had no understanding of Pocahontas other than Disney. And it's the imagery for me. And if you look up if you put in Pocahontas Disney and the images that come up, it is shocking. There's a limited edition that looks like a Kardashian, and she has eyelashes that come up. I mean, it is when you know the story and you know the history of what happened to that poor woman. And for me, Pocahontas struck a chord because she was married and then shipped off to England, and she was paraded around as a civilized savage because she was dressed up in European clothing, and their aim was to use her to get more investment back in America.
Right.
And it's that, and it was to hide the tattoos, and then we have this image. I don't want to talk about this because it's just too awful. And then, this was the oval that I then wanted to work with. And what I did was I used the dimensions from the Smithsonian records, and I sent that to Julian. And he said to me, are you going to send me a technical drawing or a sketch? And that's always like a no from me. But also this idea of, if he gets it wrong, is it really wrong? Or is it an interpretation? Again, who is authoring this? So I just sent him the width and the height and the depth that I needed to pour the pewter into. So he made a steel tool, a ring, that I could then drop onto the linen and then pour into.
So that's this.
Like this. Right. These were the small series of the miniatures, which I then dumped into the final piece. So the final piece has every evidence of the workshop in it. Wow. I got rid of everything.
Wow.
Because I didn't want to own it anymore. I'm done with the project. It's like well, I'm not, but it is. So that was really the premise that I was working with, and then this fascination with linen and the lead, and then getting to somewhere with it, and going up in scale was quite something. It nearly killed me. Yeah. So this is an image of the final piece. I did one piece, and this is classic Clarke. The first piece is absolutely shit, and it sat on the floor in the workshop for probably 6 months. And I ended up kicking it and then folding it in half like a sandwich, because it just did not do. It was the ugliest thing, and ugly in a bad way. It was just, it did not talk of, have the language, have the resonance, have the impact, have the weight, have anything. And it was a tragic lump that sat on the floor. I then sandwiched it up, and then I think it was November last year, I then melted the whole thing down, burnt the whole thing. The workshop thought the whole building was on fire because we were up in the roof and there was just smoke, because I burnt the linen as well. It's like the whole thing goes in, and just like I set fire to it. Yeah, so that's me on the floor, just using flame. And again, this idea of not smacking with hammer, but this idea of pouring. Yeah. And so with casting, with heating up, just using flame, very elemental, very, very simple process. But what for me was really beautiful was this idea of pouring from one vessel to another, and this idea of Europe, America, this traveling across. And what was extraordinary, and again, with the reflection, is I can only see one side of the piece when I'm casting this. The underside I can't view until the whole thing is done. So I don't know whether it's traveling, I don't know whether it's rupturing, I don't know if it's burning, I don't know what's going on. And this kind of action, but not being conscious or not being able to see the consequence of that action was really interesting for me within this process.
Yeah. We talked previously a little bit about the lead and linen textile and sort of the coexistence of these two materials. And that I found really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of how that concept really influenced the work and the symbolism in the work and just the sort of like deeper meanings?
I wanted to deal with that kind of assumption on metal, assumption on linen. It's not two materials that you would naturally put together. They're quite opposite. One's a solid, one's a structure. So there's a weave, there's a kind of grid, there's a constructed thing, and then you've got this liquid hot thing going on. And it was really thinking about how they could interact, how they, does one overpower, what is the relationship? Does the linen hang on and hold the piece up? Does it become the spine to the piece or the backbone to the piece? And this kind of really sort of physical relationship between the work. It weighs, I think, I don't know. The guys that came and picked it up said it weighed more than a grand piano. I think it's registered at 100 kilos.
Wow.
Which is almost the weight of two average humans, which is also, I mean, I just kept on chucking more and more material at it till I felt like it got to where it was. And also, you know, Lucy's control on the loom is extraordinary because she's so methodical and she's so precise in that method. And then I come along with this lead and just tip it. And again, this kind of the opposite in making, the opposite in technique. And when this sort of collision comes, what that impact in is, for me, becomes really interesting in the end result.
Yeah.
The other thing that was really important in this, which you can't really see, is that I needed a hole within the canvas to hang it. And I was not prepared to drill any metal out. So under that wooden bar that goes across, there's actually a pipe that is pressed against the linen to stop the lead. The lead goes around the tube so that it then creates a hole that I can then use for the hook.
Interesting.
Because there was no opportunity. I didn't want to remove material. I didn't want to edit. I didn't want to, you know, it's also about this idea of what are we told, what are we not told, what do we erase, what knowledge do we gain, how do we gain it, what's original, what's left over. So for me, that was really interesting with the press, the printing press. Again, with the paintings, it's like, what are we told? What's on the back of paintings? Yes. And also this thing about hanging it was that it is never to go against the wall. So it doesn't have a front and a back. It only has two sides. And so everything is revealed.
Yeah. Should we go to the next slide?
Please do. So this is a detail of both sides. I think. Yes, it is. And so it was really scary turning it over because I thought, oh my God, it looks like a map. I was like, I don't want to make a map. But then it's like, of course it should be a map. And then it's like, it looks like the moon, and it's like navigation and travel and the sailors and nautical. It's like, yes, this all ties in. And this I had no control over. So this was given to me because this was the side that I had no control on. The side that I did have control on, you can see bullets, you can see oxide, you can see slag. It is not purified. And again, traditionally as a silversmith, you would scoop off all the oxide from the top of the liquid casting material. You would take that off because that's scum and that's dirty. This has everything. So I chucked everything in. There's no kind of censoring. There's no edit, no kind of erasing of material. It's like all of it's in there.
Got it.
So is that kind of trying to stay consistent with the thinking and understanding how this can become such a multi-layered project. And also I must say that I did a lot of research on dyeing the linen into the black. And I researched oak gall, which is the product of a wasp that infests an oak tree, and it lays a larvae into the oak gall, and the oak gall is the food for the larvae till it flies off. But again, this idea of a swarm coming onto a host, infesting it, and then departing. Again, it's a piece of gold that's just given to the project. And it was like, wow. Yeah. And then to use my stale piss as a Morton to set the colour was just like, I have to do this. This is too Clarke not to. And to piss on the project was, I think at that point, really, really essential. Sorry, Denise. But it was like, you know, that there are things that just came down, and through my kind of exhaustion and irritation of it, it started to make real sense, and a kind of consistent connectivity between multiple elements that are within it.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it's like, it was already multi-layered, you know, and it was already rich with symbolism and layers, and then, you know, it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
That, like, I love how you kept it so true. I love how you were just honored every part of it, all the like imperfections and all the things that just kind of evolved and organically. I think that's really one of the most moving things about it.
What have we got? I don't know what the next image is. I've lost track. Oh, here we go. So this is the size of it. So I think it's probably the biggest piece I've made. It's the biggest piece I've cast. And on the left we did a runner. Some of us did a runner from the research trip in America and went to the Peacock Museum. And this image of a lynched, it was so brutally visceral and just so matter of fact. And it was like, I want this portrait to hang off center. It's got to be awkward. It's got to be irritating. It can't be resting like well, because the subject can't, it still, as a subject matter, it still doesn't rest well. It's not been resolved. It's not been sorted. It's not been acknowledged. And I wanted it almost like, you know, when you go to a relative's house and their painting's wonky on the wall, and you're always trying to refix it or relocate it and try and make it good, and squaring it away, you know, all that language, making it good, squaring it away, you know, it's like you can't. And there's not in that picture, but in the final, actually it is in that picture, but the final piece is a butcher's hook. So I wanted this kind of notion of a skin, that the canvas is a skin, that the portrait is a skin of, and that it's lynched on a butcher's hook, and it just goes right the way through. It's completely impaled. And so there's a visceral, sort of brutal quality to it, where it's like there's no sweet talk in this piece at all. It shouldn't, and I would not want it to rest easy. And there's also this kind of connotation of very old mirrors, and this idea of, you know, what's your role with this? What's your position with this? What can you see yourself in this? Which I also think is really, it touches on, I think there are lots of references that people can read into it. That's the feedback that I've had, which is really fantastic. But yeah, it was really a journey. And it's incredible. I mean, it was hanging, because of COVID, it was hanging in the workshop for, I think, 6 months. And then when the packers came and it went, it was like, oh my God, it's gone. And it left quite a big hole in the workshop. I'm so pleased that it's out and it's being looked at and digested, however uncomfortable that digestion is. I think and if it gets spat out, that's all right.
Yeah.
Have you got the video? Is that the last image?
That was the last image. I can bring up the video
of it turning. And I think, you know, to come back to Stephanie Pratt, who wouldn't give me the golden ticket out, this idea, you know, I really agree with her that it's right and essential to discuss these historical events. And it's made easier through objects. It's essential to reflect and open and question, and to really think about, you know, it is about humanity. It's not just about Mayflower. It's about how we conduct ourselves, how we relate and behave to other people. And I think, you know, we can, for me being British and you know, the amount of conversation about colonialization and decolonialization of museums and objects and you know, it's huge, and it really taps into that. And it's really interesting because I've got a quote from Stan Rushworth, who's an Indigenous elder of the Cherokee, and he said the difference between a Western settler's mindset of I have rights and an Indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself. And it's, you know, I think out of the project, you know, how I bring that back to myself and how I deal with people and situations and behavior and acknowledgement and how we can behave to a fellow human being, I think is really, really important. And even with COVID and where we are now, I think, you know, there's so much to learn from the content of this and what this historical act really opens up in the broadest sense. And I think it's really helpful to keep it broad. I think, you know, you can go microscopic, but I also think that there is so much connection with what goes on now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's really interesting how, you know, this exhibition was delayed and delayed and delayed,
Yeah.
and that we have all collectively experienced this global pandemic and just all the changes and all the questions that it's brought out. It's even more relevant. This exhibition is
Yeah.
even more relevant and really resonates with people. I think that people really, really get it at a level that I don't think would have necessarily been right on, you know, right out there at a different time. It's really fascinating. So we had a comment, someone thanking you for your discomfort in working on this. And I agree. I think that based on our previous conversation and some of what you said today is like, you really, really leaned into being uncomfortable with this whole topic. And can you talk a little bit more about that? Like you described your journey, you know, from start to finish and how it really was a journey for you and it was really challenging at times.
I think I came into the project knowing, well, within 24 hours I knew I wanted to leave. But before that, I was the only metal worker invited. And so I had the added self-pressure of representing and trying to do the best piece I possibly could for the discipline. But also it was about where do I bring in the risk? Where do I bring in the challenge? Where do I bring in a kind of new learning for me? And that was for me to not produce a lead teapot, but to say, okay, how can I approach this differently? The material I already had a relationship with, but the outcome is completely different to other work, I think. And for me, it was about, you know, the first piece went so beautifully wrong, but it's then that challenge of, okay, so what do I need to do to get it better? What do I need to do? And how do I achieve that? And, you know, Lucy provided more material than I needed in the linen, so I could have carried on going, but I only wanted to do another one. And it was like, this needs to be good enough. Thankfully, it was good enough, if not more than enough, because I'd really had it with the project. It was like, this has got to go. But I think it's that willingness to take risk and that kind of, I want to find out new things about what the potential is, what can I learn from this as a practitioner, as a silversmith, and really, and again, it was like realizing that doing a group was a safe thing for me to do, and actually say, I'm going to make one, and the one needs to be a knockout. And in some ways that's added. Sometimes when you do a group, you can have one or two that's not so great, but the good ones really carry it. And when you've got one, it's like there is no compromise. There's no kind of get out. And I felt that was really, really crucial. It's like, no, we do one, and suffer the consequences. But I'm very happy with what I sent over to America. I think I'm gutted I can't see it in situ with the other work, but it will come back to the UK next year. So yeah, I think a lot of it's about the desire to take the risk and go to sort of unknown places and spaces, and see what I can discover.
I appreciate you taking it on and dealing with the difficulty, because I think that not everyone could do that. And I think that was kind of a prerequisite. We have a question for you. Did the group of artists continue the dialogue throughout the project, or is it just while you were on site?
It was only on site, but what we did in the UK, so it was myself, Jaslyn Kerr, and Katie Schwab, we met, I think, 3 times in London, and we went to each other's workshops and met up and just talked through where we were, what we were thinking about, and kind of just gently chivied each other on and just encouraged each other to keep on going. When COVID kicked in, then that all went to pot, really. And it was really lovely to meet physically. It was really lovely to share materials and processes and ideas and thinking. That was really special. Yeah, so in the UK we did. But we didn't Skype or Zoom or any of that rubbish. I think the physical nature of all of our works is really important to understand the kind of the tactile and physical qualities that we're working with.
Yeah, it seems like most of the artists, I mean, I'm sort of speculating, but it seems like most of the artists, you all had a very specific and moving experience during the research trips, and learning from one another in that context, and then like had to like get out of and be alone to contemplate this and just hole up in the studio and figure this thing out.
It was the research trips were really intense. I mean, they were super exhausting. I mean, I found myself at one point drinking whiskey at breakfast time. That's how good it was, and it was necessary. But it was truly overwhelming in good and bad ways. I mean, for me, predominantly, it was bad because it was just like I can't keep on looking at this stuff from this perspective, and it was so driven by white middle class, and it was like, where are the other voices?
Right. No, and that's so important. I think that's really important theme for your work, is that in you confronting that, we as the viewers are also confronting that reality. I think that's really, really important. Not just of your work, but the other pieces in the show. It's really, really, and there's the uncomfortability is important. So you're definitely going to leave lead behind, but what about the linen? Is that something you might work with again?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think I don't know whether to put a line under the project and it's done and those materials are done. I wouldn't want to kind of bastardize the integrity of the project. It needs to have a reason, and I've not thought about what the reason could be. It's not that I would dismiss it, but if I could find a purpose or a role for the linen, then yes, absolutely. Okay. There could, who knows?
Okay.
Never say never.
Never say never. Okay, we've got another question. So as a metal worker that is more commonly dealing with concerns of functionality in your work, how was it to tackle a narrative? That's a great question. So I think I think you did a great job tackling a narrative. So how did you do that?
Who's that from?
Anonymous.
I can decline. No, I won't. Narrative. I think even with the domestic, the functional, there's a huge amount of storytelling within the work that I produce. So for me, it was unpacking it and I'm picking it from a different angle, because it wasn't about the history of an object. It was about the history of a nation,
Mm.
and the takeover of a nation. And so for me, that wasn't difficult, but it was really about, I couldn't believe how deep it went, and went much further than I would normally go with a historical teapot or a historical piece of silver. I don't investigate in the way that I investigated here, and there were leads and associations that took me all over the place, where it was like, oh my God, this is crazy. I mean, it was research. It was a research project like I've never researched before, and I'm not a great researcher, so I just nixed. I'm more of a thief, so I just pick stuff and take what I hear, or see, or yeah, discover. But this just kept on going and going and going.
Here's another question. Is the work in any way homage to Pollock and the American traditions of bigness and abstract expression?
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's lovely. No, I mean, it was really, I mean, I wasn't, when you see Pollock painting, his action is very painterly. You know, he's using a stick or a brush or something, and he's splattering it. And for me, the act was completely different. It was about this pouring of, and I can see where you see that, but no, that's not my direction of travel, thinking, or connection at all.
Were there any, I mean, it feels to me like the work just had a life of its own. Like it came from your practice and your process as a metalsmith. But does it, I mean, and also a reference to these, you know, these 17th century portraits that you found that were so confronting to you. So would you consider those to be influences, those portraits or those paintings, that historic paintings?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the specifics. It's the role that they have within galleries, within museums, within culture, and they're still up there. And I want them burnt. I mean, I just think that they're so strong, and they're so worshipped, and they're so revered, and they're so up there. And when I mean up, I mean physically, you're beneath them. And again, this hierarchy was just like, and I was talking to a docent in the Pilgrim's Hall, and it was like, I can't cope with this position of me, the artwork, the content, the depiction, the posture, I mean, all of it became a problem for me. And so it's not a portrait, it's the depiction of the story, and the role of painting and how that's held within culture. It's really tricky. And it's not only painting. I mean, it goes into sculpture. It goes right across the board.
Right.
But I think we need to be really careful about how we talk about it, how we present it. Everything's being reviewed now. You know, even labels. You know, who's writing the labels? Who's the author?
There's a lot of scrutiny. Yeah,
and rightly so.
Yeah, that's what I say.
And maybe, you know, unfortunately, I hate labels, but maybe you need 3 labels against every object from now on, or every painting from different perspectives who are related to that object or that piece of artwork, so that you get a rounded view, and a truer perspective of different voices, because some voices are still muted. Yeah. And for me, that is just horrendous.
Yeah. So I have one comment / question, and it may be our last one in the, you know, in the concept of timing. And actually, I like this description. It says, this work is a beautiful gut punch, and hearing your path to the finished work only adds to the weight of the story. Agree 100%. Is there any part of you that looks forward to being reunited with the work?
No, I really want to see it in the context of the other work, and that's what I'm missing, and no photograph does it. I want to see how it talks to and talks of other people's work within the exhibition. I want the experience of the exhibition that it's within, in America, and the presentation will be very, very different in Plymouth Museum. I think that's what I really miss, is the physical. I'm desperate to see. I mean, all the other work is just I have no concept of scale or anything with the photographs, but actually to walk around and have time with the whole exhibition is something that I would absolutely love to have.
It is worth that in-person experience. I have to say that I never fully can understand the exhibitions that we have on view until I'm standing in the middle of them sometimes. And this one is definitely one of these. The gravity of the whole thing really, really is felt standing amongst the objects and really absorbing it. So thank you. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to meet you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And really thank you for sharing what was really a challenging experience for you. And I think that really resonates with everyone here today, and those who are going to be able to come and see the work here and in the UK. So thank you again.
No, absolute pleasure.
It was absolutely a wonderful experience to see through your eyes. So I appreciate that. So on that note, we're going to have to end today's chat.